welcome to the Red Couch Sessions on Mom Psych, your alternative to Pop Psych. Today we're going to be speaking with Dr. Sam Alibrando, who writes a blog for Mom Psych on emotional intelligence. It's called the EQ Psych. And we have him with us today to talk about his book, Follow the Yellow Brick Road, and about his interesting analogy that he has to explain the concept of emotional intelligence. First of all, thank you for coming.
It's my pleasure.
And can you give us just an overview of your analogy?
Sure. I'll tell you how it started. And it didn't start with The Wizard of Oz, actually. It started with a theory by a woman named Karen Horney, who I had the fortune of reading when I was in grad school many years ago. We could measure it in decades, unfortunately.
And she was a psychoanalyst.
Psychoanalyst, yeah, who was actually in Europe and was moved to the United States when things started getting hot in pre-Nazi Germany. And she said that there's three ways that we interpersonally move to resolve what she called inner conflicts. The book is called Our Inner Conflicts. And in it she talked about we move one of three ways relationally when we have internal conflict. We either move against people, we move toward people, or we move away from people. And when I heard that, I go, wow, that's really quite interesting. It caught my imagination, caught my attention. And then I realized there were very few exceptions as I thought about the three ways that we basically move. And what that eventually became for me is what I call the three dimensions of the interpersonal or the relational world. And lately, it's not in the book, it'll be in my next book, I talk about the three axes, if you may, of the interpersonal world. If you could think of a three-dimensional thing, remember from geometry or algebra or whatever that is, and the one axis is the power axis, and the other is love axis, and then the what I call the knowing or the mindfulness axis. And I began to see these three things in many other places. There was another psychoanalyst named Wilfred Bion. He says there's three ways we connect to other people. We connect either through love, through hate, or through knowing. And most people hate the word hate. And I've replaced it with power, and there it is, love, power, and knowing. And he said that each one can either be positive or negative. They can have a positive impact or they can have a negative impact. And I was just captured by that idea, and I began to do lectures on it. And one day I realized that Dorothy's three companions represented the three movements. And it was like, whoa, my eyes opened up. And where love is moving toward is Tin Man, and power is courage, is lion, and knowing, Scarecrow wanted a brain. There you go, all three. And I began to see it not as a children's story anymore, but there were three archetypes of what Dorothy had to do as a young girl. To become a woman, she had to integrate those three parts of herself, is how I interpreted it. So the next time I had a chance to give a lecture, I just mentioned that in passing, and a line formed longer than I've ever had before. All they wanted to talk about was The Wizard of Oz and the metaphor, so it really captured people's attention. Someone in the audience challenged me to write at least an article or a booklet on it. So I took him up on the challenge, and on the way, as I was flying to New York, I remembered, I said, well, what else about The Wizard of Oz? And I came up with 5 principles of how we change, one of which is integrating our three companions.
Interesting. So can you explain a little bit about how you apply this in your workshops? Because you do organizational psychology, don't you, in addition to clinical psychology?
Right, I do clinical psychology. About half time I have a clinical practice, and the other half I do organizational consulting. So I work with businesses and organizations to help them, especially with their leadership and also with their putting their teams together. And I help them do a lot of selection.
And you've talked a little bit in your blog, The Emotional Intelligence Psych, the EQ Psych. You've talked a little bit about how this applies in work and relationships at home.
Yep.
But how do you generally, what's the first thing you tell people when you walk into an organization and say, okay, I'm going to explain this to you?
Well, it depends. I do one workshop called Honoring Differences. So I help people realize: are you more of a lion, or are you more of a scarecrow, or are you more of a tin man? Because we all have all three. We are all three. We function all three dimensions. But with our personalities, and particularly in certain settings, one of those is going to come out more. And it's helpful for people to know. The reason why Charlie is so short with me all the time is because he's a lion. And Mary's always so nice, you never know if she's really telling you the truth, because she's a tin man. So I have one workshop where it talks about honoring differences. Probably the part that has the most importance is how to help people develop more emotional intelligence. Because, like I mentioned, when we get out of balance, we will always become negative in one of them. So, for example, let's take Dorothy, for example. She is very similar to many, many women, and particularly if we use the movie version of The Wizard of Oz.
Because there's a difference, right?
There are some really, I would call, substantial differences between the book and the movie. I prefer the book as archetypes go. But in the movie, I don't know about you, who did you think was the weakest of the three?
Oh, I guess you would say, well, Toto.
No, but Toto
No, right, no.
represents something else, as I see it. I see the lion as the weakest. He was trembling all the
They call
time.
him cowardly, so I thought, well, it can't be that. That's
No, it is. And I think for many females, integrating that part of herself is one of the bigger challenges. Women are either by social training taught to be nice, or perhaps it's because of hundreds of generations of needing to be empathic in terms of nurturing children. Very often they have to integrate that part into their psyche more than that. Whereas men often have to integrate more Tin Man. Carl Jung even talked about that. He said that one of the issues for men is what he called anima. It's the feminine side of the masculine personality. And how do you integrate what I would call Tin Man and for the female? So for Dorothy, her big challenge was to integrate and develop all three parts of herself. But I think particularly the courageous lion is the part she had to integrate the most. And for all of us, we have to realize that. So when we're not very good at, for example, being courageous. I worked with a woman one time who was constantly being hit on by her boss. It was a non-profit. In any other organization, he would have been fired for sexual harassment. And she kept saying to me, "Oh, I can't tell him no, it'll hurt his feelings." So she would just kind of endure. Yeah. So she had a very underdeveloped lion. And for her, so what happened was she became you would become out of balance in one of the other two. So she either became very avoidant or she became overly submissive or compliant to him in a lopsided way. I talk about lopsidedness a lot. And if you think of a tripod with a camera on top of it, and if you shorten one leg, it's now lopsided. And to get us back into balance, we need to lengthen one of the legs. And it's usually the leg that we are least doing the positive in. One of my big principles is it's not what you're doing that's negative, it's what you're not doing that's positive. What she wasn't doing, this woman, was being able to tell him no, to set a boundary. That was the part she had a hard time doing. And so in our therapy was to help build that capacity for her, in this case to integrate more healthy lion.
We have some people sometimes who think emotional intelligence is really just about understanding your emotions, understanding other people's emotions. They don't see it necessarily as this change psychology, this path to change or road to change.
Right.
They see it as we're just understanding emotions so we can manipulate people. And I read an article recently by a guy who says there's a dark side of emotional intelligence, He says that if you can do good or evil with your knowledge of people's emotions. You can use it to, like Hitler. He called Hitler
emotionally intelligent Hitler. Yes.
So would you agree with that or not?
No.
No.
Well, it depends on how you define emotional intelligence. It's one of those kind of, people use that word in different ways. If this author suggests that emotional intelligence is only the ability to manipulate emotions, I suppose he or she has a case. But I look at it more in those three dimensions. And Hitler did not have much love. The love axis for him was underdeveloped. The fact that the regard and care and respect of other people was very, very twisted. And therefore I would not call him emotionally intelligent, because for me an emotionally intelligent person has that wonderful balance of all three, where Lion and Scarecrow and Tin Man are all working together. I use the word synergistic in my book, where the three together actually become more powerful than any one of them by themselves. And so my understanding of emotional intelligence and my definition wouldn't allow for manipulation, and what almost sounds like sociopathy or psychopathology, right, or sociopathy.
Exactly.
So a sociopath or a psychopath could be emotionally intelligent, not according to my definition.
Right. I've always seen emotional intelligence as having a prosocial aspect to it. You're calling it love. That's part of the love aspect.
The wonderful thing about it is it's a pro-social and a pro-self at the same time. Mm-hmm. That's what makes it such an interesting dynamic, because it's pro-self and pro-other. Right. And that's why it takes a lot to be able to do that, because you're balancing those two tricky pieces. The way I look at it, the lion side is very, I say this, that Tin Man is oriented to the other. It's the part of the human being that's oriented toward the other. It's our love for the other, our regard for the other, our empathy with the other, and our need of the other is all part of the Tin Man, or what I call blue sometimes when I give it colors. And the red, or moving against, or lion side of us is all oriented about the self. It's about getting our needs met. It's about telling the truth, our truth. It's setting boundaries. It's, as I say, having a country that has a standing army that's a moving against, on the moving against axis. The beauty is, how do you make both of them work together synergistically? And that is an emotionally intelligent person throwing in a little Scarecrow for the objectivity part. Scarecrow is about neither self nor other. It's about knowing. It's an objective part of and it's very pronounced in Homo sapiens. I don't know how much chimpanzees or cats have a knowing side of them, but certainly it's a very strong characteristic of being a human. And it's our ability to observe an event. And it's very similar to the very strong movement these days called mindfulness movement.
Right.
And I say mindfulness is all about Scarecrow.
When we're talking about mindfulness, I wanted to get to how you develop some of these things, because I've seen some studies recently where they're using mindfulness to specifically develop the compassion side.
Yes.
Right? But so when you have somebody who needs to develop, say, the lion or the Scarecrow or the Tin Man, what are some of the exercises you have them do? Okay.
I'll answer the question generally, and then I have really, I think, a good example from the work world that I use all the time. I will sometimes have people, like a person who's very moving against, like a bully type of person, to teach them to go right straight to moving toward and being compassionate might be a really hard movement for them. So I will sometimes have them move into Scarecrow first, and then, in other words, have them step out of their anger and out of their control and step back and say, look at what's going on, what's happening here. And then you can start to help them with the empathy at that point, which is a moving toward thing. So I will sometimes have them move out into Scarecrow and then move into moving and then into Tin Man, because that one other move is just too hard for them.
And do you do that the other direction?
Oh yeah, of course. Someone who's too moving toward, someone who is always giving up too much of themselves to other people, or always giving in. I might say, before you stick up for yourself, I want you to move back into Scarecrow and take a look at what's going on. It's the mindfulness. I find mindfulness one of the most important places for our own change, is that observing part of us. So let me tell you about this gentleman I worked with. I call him Miguel in all my writings. Miguel was the owner of a company which then merged with another company. So he was co-owner with another person in this company. He was brilliant as a businessman. And we were called in to this company because they were having so many problems. They had a leadership team made up of about 6 people, of which Miguel was one of the key stakeholders. But there were 6 people who were in the what we call the C level, and they were running the company, and they were fighting and backbiting and all kind of problems. So we did some work with them, and I assigned myself to work with Miguel as an executive coach. What happened with Miguel is that he would get really poor boundaries. He would get involved with everybody's business. No regard for other people's boundaries, no regard for his own boundaries, which is a breakdown in moving toward. Right? That's a Tin Man problem. No boundaries. Okay. And then when he didn't get his way, he'd blow up. He would literally have temper tantrums. Here's this man who was the owner of this company, and he would actually have temper tantrums in front of his staff. Okay? And it was really disturbing to everyone there. And so what I asked him to do, and he was a very eager man and a very ambitious man and a very sincere man. And so I said, I'm going to ask you to do something that's really going to be hard. So you could see what, in my theory, he's overly moving toward, overly moving against. Mm-hmm. Over Tin Man, too much lion. What's he not doing? Scarecrow. He wasn't doing Scarecrow. According to my theory here is, you don't try to make him let more better boundaries or even make him less angry. What you want to do is help him be more Scarecrow. Mm-hmm. Don't focus on the negative. Focus on the positive he's not doing, just like you said a few minutes ago. During board meetings, he would dominate board meetings. Mary would talk, then he would talk. Then Ben would talk, then he would talk. And then he would talk, and then he would talk. And when we did the interviews, everyone just hated meetings or board meetings because it was just Miguel talking and talking, and nobody there knew how to have a courageous conversation, which is another workshop I do on having a courageous conversation. But that's beside the point, isn't it? So I said, I want you, Miguel, to do something. You are losing all your power in these meetings because no one listens to you because you talk too much. Would you be willing to do this? I was helping build Scarecrow. I said, every time you want to talk, put a little mark on a scratch paper. And after 5 scratches, then you can talk.
Well, that could be hard for some
people. It was almost impossible. It drove him crazy, but he, like I say, he was a very motivated and very sincere man, so he tried it. And after a while, he started being able to do it, and so he found something very curious. He started to listen. He wasn't looking for his next line. He was actually listening to what Mary and Ben were saying, and he started reflecting more. So he started to practice more Scarecrow, and eventually the owners started asking him questions, and he would give them well thought out answers, and they all loved the answers, and they bought into it, and they used it. And it changed the whole tone. So the idea here is not to try to change what we're doing that's negative, but try to build into our repertoire of the part that we weren't doing very well. For him, it was Scarecrow. Mm-hmm. Somebody else is Tin Man. Somebody else, it's Lion. And at any time, any of us could have, at any moment or any context, it may be different for any of us.
And you said he was very motivated. to change? What happens when you have somebody who's not very motivated? Let's say, I assume this could happen, say, in a marriage counseling.
Yeah.
You might have one who's motivated and one who may not be so much.
You want to hear the nice answer or the real answer?
But both.
The nice answer is, oh, they can change. The real answer is, if people don't eventually come around and take ownership and are willing to take a look at themselves honestly, they're not likely to change. And one of the things I do in work is I help them decide on who they have to let go of, and when that's and in therapy, very often that person won't be the person coming in. It's usually their spouse or their child or their parent, and then I have to help that client just deal with someone who may not change.
Is there a way to motivate people to change?
You know what? One of the things that can happen, that's a great question. One of the things that can happen sometimes is when the one party changes, they change the dynamics. So the person may not change from the inside out, but they may now change because the dynamics are different. Let me give you another example. I love this thing, because what happens is they may not change, but you can change the dynamics. And this is a good example of that. I work with a man who is married to a woman who is a force to be reckoned with. She is a very powerful businesswoman, very successful, and is very intolerant of anything that doesn't go her way. So here's one example for you. My client found out that she lost a client that day. So he, being very empathic like he is, went out of his way to prepare a beautiful meal for her. He's a cook, he's an artist, he's the kind of the soft guy, right? And very sensitive. So he creates this beautiful meal. She walks in the door and she goes, "You ass, I can't believe you did this." She goes, "I told you never to use my mother's china." And there was one spoon from his mother's china that he put out there for the meal. And she just laid into him. And he just and what he does is he succumbs. He does Tin Man. He tries to be the good boy. He tries to do everything right. And then when he fails, he moves away. He'll hide out in his little room in the back of the house, and he'll have a couple Jack Daniels and just tune out. So the thing that was missing for him was lying. What is she doing too much of is lying, and that's often happens with couples, by the way. We often kind of lock into each other. He didn't do lying very well, and she overly did lying. Mm-hmm. She had a very, very hard time ever admitting anything she's ever did that was wrong or perhaps insensitive. In fact, up until this day, I don't think she's ever apologized for anything. But here's an example of a person who doesn't have that. But what happened was he started getting more and more in touch with his lion side. And one day he said to her, "You can't talk to me like that. That's rude." And he just, boom, out of nowhere said that to her. And she got really quiet. She went off into the bedroom and then came out a half an hour later as nice as anything. Never apologized, never acknowledged it, but because he came up with a lion and got in balance, now she couldn't get away with it as much. So she had to change to fit the dynamic. So she still has no idea of how much of a out of balance she is. But because he now can move dynamically, she has to work with that more. So she is actually way more respectful of him. So not because she's changed from the inside, but the dynamic got changed.
She's kind of been forced to change some of her approach.
Yeah, and this is because it took a dance for them to do it. Right. There are some cases where you can really have a victim, but many times a victim can't live without the perpetrator, or the perpetrator can't have unless there's a victim. And when he stopped being a victim and started speaking up for himself, it changed the whole thing.
So, do you feel this has been a lasting change for them?
For them? For him.
For him.
He's learning more and more how to be immediate. I call it being on the balls of his feet rather than back on his heels. Isn't that nice? Think about that. Yeah. Back on your heels, balls of your feet. Anyway, I like it.
Yeah.
So he's learning how to do that more and more, and so she's respecting him more and more. I don't think she's likely to come around and say, I use anger to manipulate people, and I blame you for things that are really based on my own insecurity. I don't know if that's going to happen.
Okay,
you can hope. You can hope.
That was the dynamic when there's one person overly doing lion.
Yeah.
Is that pretty much the main issue you'll have with couples, or is there ever a problem with somebody overdoing Scarecrow or overdoing Tin Man? Can you?
How many? You work with mothers all the time. Most mothers are, not all of them, some of them are married.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard them ever complain about their husband being too distant or unemotional, or they work too much and I never see them? I can never get anything out of him. That's too much Scarecrow.
Yeah. Okay.
Scarecrow is about being detached.
Okay.
So healthy Scarecrow is that healthy removing of yourself and observing. If you overly do it and it's negative, is you become detached, unemotional, disconnected.
How, as another person, if you were in that situation where the Scarecrow wasn't motivated to change, and using that technique you talked about just now, where you're changing something about yourself to bring about change in another person.
That's a little bit harder, isn't it? Because how do you, my client moved against a moving against. How do you move away from a moving away? Mm-hmm. I think one way you do it is you give them a little bit of space, and you start to develop more of your own autonomy. You develop your own interests. You develop your own, so you're not so dependent on them. Because dependency, too much Tin Man, is going to scare that person. So you begin to develop your own identity, your own interests, your own friendships, and that sometimes will leave room for that person to move back into the interpersonal space.
Well, now you talk about wizards and witches in this. What is that about?
Wizards and witches. This is how I interpret them. I see wizards as, and you think about it, when Dorothy gets there, the first thing she wants to do is get out, right? That's the first principle, by the way, is we don't change in Kansas, we change in Oz. Mm-hmm. As adults, the real change comes not when we're in our paradigms we know and are familiar with and comfortable with, even if it's painful, we're still familiar with. That's what I call Kansas. Oz is when we get thrown out of whack. Right?
So it's adversity that brings change.
Adversity or being tilted in some way.
Being out of our element.
Out of our element. Right. People grow more when they're divorcing than probably any other time because they're thrown into they're thrown into Oz now. And we do, either we get out of Oz by drinking or working too much or doing whatever we do to get out of Oz, escape, or we do the courageous thing and stay in Oz and try to work through. That's principle number one. The second one is wizards. And first thing Dorothy wanted to do was find a wizard. Why? Because the wizard was going to save her, was going to do everything, was going to rescue her.
Fix it for her.
Fix it for her. And we all have wizards. We all have ideas in our head that we think are going to make us happy. If I was only richer, if I were thinner, if I were faster, if I was younger, if I was this or that, if my wife was only, if my husband was this or that, then I would be happy. Right? We make wizards out there all the time, rather as a substitute for us going on our own journey. And what Dorothy realized was, by being on the journey, that's how Dorothy found courage and love and mindfulness, by being on the journey.
So you can't get out of Oz until you've gone through that journey.
Absolutely. And we have Toto, who I see as a metaphor for our best friends. Toto pulled the curtain back and said, that's not a real wizard.
Interesting.
And for us to grow, we have to eventually realize that money might get us a nice car, but it won't make us necessarily happy. And so our friends are the ones who come by and pull back the curtain and say, you think you're going to be happy I have a friend she thinks she'll be happy if she gets married, even though the research says otherwise.
Right.
So that's what I mean by wizards. Lately I've been really interested in witches. Witches are those scary parts of ourselves that we spend most of our life running away from. It could be a self-image thing. It could be our anger we're afraid of. It could be our dependency we're afraid of. It could be our jealousy or whatever. It could be any number of things inside of us that scare us. Self-esteem, we think we're bad. And recently, since it would have been in the book if I knew this, but since writing the book, I came across the work of Eckhart Tolle, and he uses a phrase called pain body. And he describes pain body as the accumulation of all our pain and suffering that we inherited from our parents, that we got during childhood, that we picked up from our culture. Mm-hmm. And because it's painful and it never was naturally integrated, it stays like a clump inside of us. It's a mental state, a negative energy state. And we have it inside of us. And I said, that's what a witch is. It's really interesting. When Baum wrote the book, the common understanding of witches in that 1900 was not the witches we have today. A witch was a negative thing that was held together by negative energy and with no water in it. Witches were seen as they were held together by black magic or negative energy, and that's why if they got doused with water, that's why they would melt. And here I go, what an amazing metaphor. We have witches inside of us. We have pain body inside of us. And we spend most of our life running away from it. And what the message is, until you face your witch and bring water, I call water truth and grace, forgiveness and truth. And we bring that and we begin to start melting. It doesn't melt quite as fast as Dorothy's witch, but we begin to melt those scary parts of ourselves. And then they get naturally integrated in us in a creative way. But most of us, like I said, like Dorothy, run away from our witches.
We're not doing that. Well, again, mindfulness allows you to also know yourself better, right?
Absolutely.
So this is
awareness, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Awareness.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. It's interesting how it does seem to all hold together on this little stories, one single story.
Isn't it amazing?
Yeah, I can't wait. So what is your next?
My next book, I'm going to write a book just about the three, what I call the interpersonal triangle. And I'm not going to use the Dorothy metaphor for this. I'm just going to call it either against, toward, and away, or power, love, or knowing, or colors. And I have done so much thinking about this, and I'm just dying to put it into a bigger book, just all about that. And I want to sink my teeth into each movement and talk about them in depth. For example, the idea of hate. We hate, but we live in a world of carnivores. I am probably going to have chicken. I'm going to eat another living thing sometime in the next 2 days.
Probably sooner than you think.
and that we live in a world where there really is survival of the fittest. And how do we talk about that? How do we have I love Native Indian, where when they would kill an animal, they would bless it. That's more synergistic. That's more balanced. And I want to talk about love and how important love is, and that's what really makes us different. And then I really want to talk about mindfulness, as how important that is to our growth, and what I think is going to bring Homo sapiens into the next level of higher functioning is going to be in that area, I believe.
What you've been saying points to the fact that real emotional intelligence isn't something you can use just to manipulate people. You can't really use it for evil. If you're using it for evil,
it's not emotional. Not according to my emotional intelligence,
right.
where it's the balance of all three.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you may want to pick up this book if you don't have it already. It's Follow the Yellow Brick Road by Dr. Sam Alibrando. And do please check out his blog with Mom Psych. It's called the EQ Psych, which is a little play on emotional intelligence, right?
Sure.
IQ, EQ, right?
Yep.
Now, your last blog post was about a little consulting project you did with an actor.
Yes.
You want to tell people
It's
about
probably one of my favorite blogs that I've done recently. It's with the actor's name is Kim Coates, and he plays this character Tig on Sons of Anarchy. And he had this horrific scene where he has to witness the death of his daughter by another criminal. And he came to me and said, "Sam, what happens to a person when they go through this?" And I said, "Well, let's sit down," and we talked about it. And I went through this whole stages of the Tig character is very moving against. He's a biker in a bike club.
So he's the lion.
So he'll be the lion, and that's how he did his life. And I talk in the blog. He's chained, so he can't do anything. So the next thing he does is he moves in the Tin Man. Tin Man, he's begging and pleading. He says, "Take me, kill me instead." Right? That's the Tin Man thing, sacrificing yourself. And then as a last resort, where nowhere else to go, he went to Scarecrow, which is he dissociated, he disconnected. And this is what young children go through when they get abused. They'll dissociate.
Right.
And he just kind of went offline. I talk about it as like a circuit breaker popping. And so I said that would be very likely what would happen. And so he took some of the ideas and he did a scene that I've heard many people talk about, Emmy Award.
A very standout performance.
Oh, it's amazing.
Well, there's another reason to come back to his blog. You never know when you might come up against a celebrity. So please check out the book and the blog. And thank you for coming and speaking with us, Dr.
My pleasure.
And we'll talk again.